We've all been attracted to someone else's boyfriend or someone we shouldn't. But those feelings of recognition, attachment, and belonging can sometimes become profoundly confusing. And people can become overwhelmed by feelings that they never expected and they don't understand. So basically, I can understand people could say, well, why you can have that, but why don't you walk away? And I've wondered that myself.
For many adopted children, finding their birth parent is imagined as the end of a lifelong search for identity. But for Sophia Greenwood, not her real name, it marked the beginning of an extraordinary and deeply controversial story. When someone is reunited with biological parents, some experts say there is sometimes an additional issue called genetic sexual attraction. Adoption charities warn it's important not to act on those feelings, but this is something that Sophia says she knew nothing about. When reunited with her biological father, she experienced those feelings of attraction, and they had a 5-year relationship. They also had a child together. Her memoir explores what happened afterwards. I sat down with Sophia, who began by telling me about that moment that she reconnected with her father. We have slightly edited her voice to keep her anonymity. Sophia, welcome.
Hello, Hugo. Thank you very much for having me.
Thanks for being with us. Look, you were adopted at 5 weeks old. You were raised in Yorkshire in what comes across as a loving family. Tell us a bit about the catalyst that first inspired you to search for your birth parents.
Yes, okay. Well, I grew up always knowing, as far as knowing whatever that means for a child. So I know I was told, but I had no concept of what it meant and no memory of being told. I was sort of often told I was chosen and special and so on. But so it really, I went into my profession when I was 18, and I started to just think about that concept of being adopted and supposedly having, a whole nother biological family out there. But it was really just, it was an idea that I'd just grown up with. So it was really when I I first of all did look into it initially when I was 18, but I very quickly just pulled away because it felt very strange and I felt nervous about it. So I just left it. And then a few years later, when I was sort of 23, I think, I found myself in the room with a mother giving birth. And it was the most profound experience to actually see a baby coming out of a mother. And that's when it just crystallized. Whoa, I was in that another mother, and obviously there was a lot of joy in the room, and I had that profound sense of the union of the mother and baby, and how that baby was part of her in every way, and how vulnerable it was to her care and love, and then it made me start to think, why did she give me away, and how could that happen? And that's what started me really thinking about doing some searching.
And did you have an image in your mind of who your birth parents might be? Did you have a perspective of them?
No, not at all. I mean, because it was a fantasy. It wasn't. I had nothing to anchor the reality of it. I had parents. I had a. You just grow up with that reality, and so it didn't feel real. It just felt like a story. Um, so I didn't even try and imagine what they might look like or anything because I just couldn't do that. There was nothing
Mm.
to that I could draw on in that regard.
Sure. Look, when you first did meet your birth father, who we're calling Michael, describe to us how that felt, what you saw in him, how you responded to him.
Um, yeah, so we had contact first of all through writing. He sent me a letter and a VHS video introducing himself. So I saw him live on this video, and he was just obviously a stranger telling me, "Hello, I'm sorry that we had to give you up. We had no choice," and just introducing himself, and just a bit like you and I meeting today. He just struck me as an intelligent, thoughtful man. who seemed very nice and was being very genuine. And but it's quite surreal because I obviously had no uh, conscious connection with him. But after that, we had lots of phone calls, and and the phone calls could go on for hours really because he was a very articulate, chatty man, very intelligent, and we seemed to just get on. You know, it was like a balm to my soul. This sort of uh, just the way he described things and the world and his philosophies and insights into things, I just found it absolutely fascinating. And so we would just talk for hours, and that went on for many weeks, and to the point where we sort of it felt like there was a sort of psychic connection between us because we were on the other sides of the world, but I could think about him. Oh, I'd like to have a chat with him, and then he would ring, you know, that sort of thing.
Mm.
And eventually, he just said, you know, I think it's time we met. How about I come over and visit you for you know a couple of weeks, and we could get to know each other. And I mean, I'm 24 years old, okay, and so I was, you know, it's quite young in many ways. I'd been to boarding school. You know, maybe I was a bit immature, although I'd been a qualified physio for a while. So I was just like, yeah, this would be fantastic to meet you. Great. And so I when I picked him up from the airport with my best friend, um, it was just exciting and interesting to be meeting this person who I'd developed rather a nice uh,
Mm.
connection with, you know, and I was intrigued, um, but I didn't have any sense of, you know, I wasn't concerned, but I hadn't been able to speak to my birth parents about it because they didn't want to know. You see, they were very threatened by the idea of me searching for my birth parents, and so you know, I did it all on my own. So, and I'd had not spoken to anybody about the complexities that might arise. So I just sort of rather naively just bounced along, thinking, "Oh, this is going to be interesting," and
Mm.
picked him up from the airport and took him home to my friend's house, and we sat in the garden, sort of drinking tea and a little bottle of Cointreau that he'd bought on the flight over to sort of toast our first meeting. And off we dived into just getting to know each other, a bit like you and I might do if we sort of went to the pub for the first time.
Sure. And at what point and how did you realise that the relationship, that the attraction had become a romantic one, even a sexual one?
Oh, well, you see, yeah. So all through the conversations on the phone and so on, I mean, I never sort of thought, oh, I think I fancy this guy, or you know, I never had any fantasies of any of that. It was just like I'm going to meet my biological father. Wow. Um, but by the time we're in front of each other, we had a depth of connection because of all our conversations and so on. So we were meeting as strangers, and yet we were now not strangers. We were meeting with the knowledge that we were, you know, probably biologically related. I mean, there wasn't any paternity testing back then. And, you know, there had been some doubts in his mind, like, is this really, I'll go and meet her and sort of
Mm.
see if I feel like she is, or something, you know, in a way, um, knowing she probably is, but wow, it's just, it was very complex for him as well. So, so we went off to, we talked for hours in the garden, and it was just, it was very easy. But I am just being a woman. On some level, I can see that I was wanting him to like me. So, of course, I was just being perhaps how a woman might be meeting a guy who you like and you admire and you feel drawn to and you want them to like you. So you can come across perhaps a bit coquettish, perhaps a little bit, you know, you're just being charming and open and warm. And he is trying, he wants me to like him too, of course. And we're both thinking in our heads, wonder what he thinks of me, wonder what she thinks of me. It's a very
Mm.
unusual situation. And so then we went off for lunch, and it was a sunny day, and we would just, and then it sort of was just feeling like there was lots of laughter. So there was lots of good hormones going around, I suppose, and this and that. But also, I just had never, uh, it's a naivety in as much as like I'd never had to sat down with someone and them saying, now remember who this is, and remember that you're going to
Hmm.
have confusing and complex feelings, and you might feel those feelings will feel similar to being attracted to somebody, but talk to us about it, or this is how you manage it, or don't be alone together initially, all those sorts of things. So it just felt so intoxicatingly lovely, and bearing in mind really that ultimately this is an adoption story. you know um, I know that it's easy to focus on uh, the relationship that we had, but ultimately it's a story about adoption, and sort of the the story that is shaped by early separation and the lifelong search for connection that follows. And that's the
Mm.
issue. You see, humans all have a need for attachment and presence and authenticity, and they're both needed to survive, for survival. And because of the separation of mother and baby in the early days, even though I had loving parents, there's a sort of lifelong search for sort of this sense of true belonging, which we all
Of
take for
course.
granted in a normal family, and so by the end of the lunch, I'm just feeling like, wow, just loving being in his presence. And so I don't remember having thoughts then, but by the time I'm lying on the sofa that night and he's gone up to bed, I'm thinking, well, this is very confusing, because I'm feeling how it would normally feel when you're just attracted to somebody,
Yeah,
and
for
and
sure.
I yeah.
I mean, so the term genetic sexual attraction, it's not widely known, but it's basically it's a hypothesis for what it was that you experienced. Before people react to it, what do you think they should know about it?
Yes, that's a very good question. Thank you for asking that. So basically, the Westermark effect is central to understanding GSA, and it's one of the most important points for people to try and understand. So the prevailing theory is called the Westermark effect, and when children grow up together during early childhood, they develop a natural sexual aversion to one another. We all do. We take it for granted. We don't. Try not to fancy our brothers and sisters because we've studied the law or genetics or whatever. We just don't, and it acts as a protective boundary. And basically, if you grow up together before the age of 6, that is a natural boundary in place. Um, when relatives are separated at birth and they don't grow up together, then that natural imprinting process may never occur. And so um, basically, GSA it's a genetic sexual attraction or genetic attraction. It is a term that has been given to this sort of most powerful um, magnetic attraction when people meet for the first time. And
Mm.
as I said, people haven't studied genetics or criminal law. There's a natural psychological barrier that develops in early childhood, which you don't get when you haven't grown up together.
Sure.
Yeah.
Um, I'm sure. I mean, there'll be people listening thinking, look, however powerful the attraction, it's
Yeah.
not. It's not necessarily an unusual situation to be powerfully attracted to somebody, but still have reasons not to act on that attraction. Most of
It,
us go through that experience many times in our lives. If we're just simply with somebody else, or the person we're attracted to is with somebody, or if there are practical reasons, or
absolutely.
whatever. Why do you feel
Absolutely.
this was so overwhelming that those kind of considerations? Because you did know the situation, you did know the taboo.
Yeah.
Why it didn't apply?
Absolutely. Well, that of course is the crux of it. That
Mm.
is what's not really very well understood, and it's much more common than people realise. But the research is limited, and people don't really want to talk about it, and that is very, very important. So many adoptees describe finally meeting someone who looks like them, moves like them, laughs like them, and understands them biologically, on a level for the first time in their lives. This isn't just about, we've all been attracted to someone else's boyfriend or someone we shouldn't, but those feelings of recognition, attachment, and belonging can sometimes become profoundly confusing. And people can become overwhelmed by feelings that they never expected and they don't understand. So basically, I can understand people could say, well, why you can have that, but why don't you walk away? And I've wondered that myself. I mean, obviously, I look back and that's why I'm so fascinated about it and to explore it, even all these years later, because I understand this isn't a lack of morals, and it's not about intelligence or we didn't a choice that was morally wrong. It's about psychology, attachment, and neurobiology. It's like two magnets that were completely drawn together and you cannot pull them apart. And everybody that has ever talked about GSA openly say that, they would have left their children and their families and they were obsessed. They just had to be together. And it's not like anything else that anyone's ever really experienced. And understanding it doesn't mean condoning it. I mean, obviously, it's very complex, but it is it's much more common than people realise. But that's not really the point. Even if only a small proportion of reunited families experience this, those people deserve understanding and professional support rather than silence. And the only reason really that I wrote the memoir, because it was many years ago and we were getting on with our lives, is really in the hope to starting some conversation, maybe some more research, and just a bit more understanding about why this can happen.
Yeah.
Because I had a normal life, and so did he, and I wasn't looking to go down 10 minutes road. So we once. Unfortunately, again, if we'd had support, we wouldn't have then gone off on holiday together for 2 weeks and got deeper and
Sure.
deeper. You know.
Yeah. I mean, it's clear from how both you talk about it and indeed how you write about it that you're not asking for approval or sort of absolution or anything like that. You're clearly just writing to help people understand what happened. I'm interested in the power balance between you and Michael, because it does come across when you describe them, you describe the relationship, that there is a bit of a power imbalance, but you don't seem to judge his motivations at all. You must have thought about his motivations. As you say, you were a relatively young woman, relatively inexperienced in the world. He was not, and I wonder how you thought about him at the time. Well, maybe not at the time, but maybe later, whether you were perhaps more judgmental of him than you are of yourself, with good reason.
Well, that's interesting that you say with good reason. So therefore, that sounds like you might tend to think that I was perhaps a victim because I was younger and he should have known better
Sure.
because he was older. And I
Yeah.
understand that bias potential. Um, but in the relationship, um, I felt completely safe. Um, I felt completely unconditionally loved. He was, kind and thoughtful. There was no control. A lot of relationships do have narcissistic things and control going on. There was none of that with us. We were completely and totally in tune, and we were just happy together. Now, obviously, later on, once I left and had to deal with all the fallout, and of course my parents and family's perspectives, which of course were along those lines of what you just said. Oh, he should have known better. Again, this is why um, this is so important to try and understand, or at least uh, to give people pre-reunion counselling to warn that this is something. But ultimately, genetic attraction, I think, whatever you like to call it, because I mean that is a phrase that it's been given, but it's all really about biology, neurobiology, and this trauma attachment stuff. So basically, he had trauma too because he had got a girl pregnant. He was young, and it happens, and he was a really well brought up, decent man, and never really got over that himself that he had that had happened, and would often obviously think about this
Yeah.
this
Sure.
child that was potentially his. So basically, there are times, of course, when it's been really, really difficult that I've myself said, well, why did you pursue me? Why did you come to France? Why didn't you? But you see, this is why it's so difficult because uh, he was just as uh, deeply, his love was just totally unconditional, but it's mixed in with, I suppose, biological unconditional, where you would just never leave your child or whatever. But then I wasn't his child, but the love was just beyond what you might normally have with people. So there was
Sure.
just a sense that you could just never uh, walk away. And there have been times when I said, "You ruined my life." I've done all of that. We've been through all those ups and downs of that. But ultimately, that's why I've researched more and more and more. And as I've matured, I've always come back to understanding that it was just as hard for him as well. And he's,
Mm.
been writing a thesis about the Westermarck effect, actually, because we don't want it to happen. Obviously, you wouldn't ever wish it to happen to anybody, but the love still remains. It's because it's familial,
Yeah.
but it's complex.
No, I understand as best I can. Of course, I do. Look, you are together for a while. You have a son who is now an adult. I'm interested during the period that you were together. Obviously, you were living in a place where nobody knew your biological relationship. How stressful was that for you on a day-to-day basis? Did you sort of live with a constant fear with everyone you met of being found out?
Yes, of course. I mean, I've never lived a secret in my life, and I knew we were good people and we really loved each other. I mean, I can't tell you how, there's he's it was just wonderful, but it was also awful because it was just an agony of, well, why can't we just can't we're not normal, we can't be out there um, being completely free without this sort of thing hanging over. So we lived together and we worked together and we enjoyed a life and we had friends, but I used to always obviously think, gosh, if they knew, what would they think, and what are we going to do? But I had a the love was so pure and it felt so right, and I know I'm a good person and a thoughtful, intelligent person, and I know he is too. So on some level, I didn't feel this darkness or this shame. I felt confused and sorry for us, and like but when I told uh, my first, our first friends that we told, we sat down for dinner and we just decided to tell them, and it was absolutely beautiful the way they received it. A married couple who'd known us for a while just totally received it with surprising equanimity and compassion, and that has always been the case ever since I've told anyone else in my life, and all the people I know in my life know. I never tell them straight away, but I mean, when I trust them and so on. All I've ever had is, wow, I wish you told me earlier. Oh my goodness, what you've been through. I can totally understand how that happened. You were strangers. And that's been the incredible understanding of it. But it did eat away at me, of course, because my parents didn't know uh, that I was okay over there. They thought I'd had you know, I was now their wayward daughter who had had a child with a random boyfriend, and obviously I wanted her to know I was happy and safe
Mm.
and it was okay, but I couldn't, and so that was very hard.
The relationship ultimately doesn't last, and at some point you have to tell your son, who we're calling James, about his background, what has happened. You write that he was 9 when you told him, which seems awfully young to deal with something so heavy. How did he take it, and how has he taken it since?
Yes, that's a good question, and I look back sometimes and think, gosh, what why did I tell him when he was 9? But as you can imagine, I knew the whole thing, and here's my boy in front of me, perfect and beautiful and happy. And I'm thinking, well, but this is about him, and when am I going to tell him? Because he's got to know. And I just remember thinking, well, if I don't tell him before he's a teenager, he could have a crisis of identity. He could be out there drinking and be with mates. Or, I don't know. I just thought, gosh, when you're full of your hormones and so on, and you feel like something's been kept from you your whole life, that would be terrible. And I really wanted him to. I just wanted the truth
Mm.
because he was so loved and he came from love. And so I just kept thinking about it more and more. And then, really, at 9 years old, you see, he was a beautifully intelligent young man and full of love himself. And I talked to my parents about it, and they were all up for telling him, and they had different motives for telling him because they wanted to sort of tell him that his dad was a bad man, and because there were mixed feelings, as you can imagine, from them, and I feel great compassion for them, and they dealt with it amazingly. But my dad, my adoptive dad, um, came round, and we sat down with him. Now, my memories of it are fairly vague, but and obviously a 9-year-old doesn't understand what you're saying. All he understands is that he's being told something that's obviously he doesn't really understand, but all he knows is he loves mummy and he loves daddy. And whatever anyone might be saying about daddy, um, no, daddy's a good man. He loves me. I love him. I'm safe with him. And so whatever it is, that's, it's okay because I love daddy. So that he just handled it very well. And over the years, and he's in his 30s now, he's totally and always just said, look, I even forget about it. I mean, I, I don't even think about it. I'm here. This is my life. You're my mum and dad. Um, and he's never once had a crisis of identity or sort of said to me, I'm a freak, or you shouldn't have done that. Or, I mean, as an older adult studying a lot of psychology and different things, he has said, gosh, I don't think, maybe he's thought about his dad and thought, gosh, really, what, couldn't it have done? And this is where the GSA think. And I think unless you've walked a mile in our shoes, unless you have experience,
Mm.
if you're adopted and you meet someone and you've got that draw, but it's a cocktail as well, Hugo, because I'm not saying that everybody that feels that would get into our situation so deeply.
Of course,
Um,
of course.
because
Does your son worry about telling other people if he has a relationship himself, if he has children himself, that
no,
he'll have to declare this in a relationship?
no, no, he doesn't, because I've talked to him about that, and he says, look, I told my best friends, I hadn't told them for years, never thought I'd bother. And then a few years ago, I thought I'd tell my three best friends. And they were all just totally amazing and like, oh my God, now we love you even more. And, and then at some point uh, he might, it might come up and then they'll say, oh God, yeah. Oh yeah, we forgot about that.
Mm.
I'll say to him, have you thought about that? And he says, oh, look, I
Mm.
don't even think about it, Mum. It's just not a thing. What's the point? I'm here. I love you. This is me. This is my life, and it's our story. But what can we do? We can't change it. And he's
Yeah,
not worried about, you know, he's not worried about his children or anything. I don't know. It's amazing, but
yeah, I
that's
understand. Look, we're nearly out of time, but finally, tell us a
well,
bit about your legal situation and what problems this has caused legally, and how it feels when something that's so intimate and personal to you suddenly becomes something that the law is interested in, which I suppose it just feels very, very incongruous.
yes. So obviously, because naturally incest is against the law, of course, because it's abhorrent. But this is most unusual. So obviously, because we are biological, it falls under that category. But it's not. There's no victim and abuse. So basically, an ex reported him eventually. So it might never have been come out, but she had some bitterness and revenge issues. So she reported it, and of course, because it was unusual, they're thinking, well, is there a child, is there abuse here? What's going on? So they had to, you know, take him through the process of questioning and so on. And they took him to court to explore this. And of course, on paper, this was 2006, when GSA was even less understood. They were like, "Oh, well, you're a professional man, and you've had this thing with your daughter, so therefore it's naughty. We must punish you or something." And but his lawyer presented the genetic sexual attraction research and papers, and at the end of the process, the judge said to him, "I was actually considering giving you a custodial sentence, but clearly there's something going on here much deeper than I can even try and imagine or understand. And there's you were victims of some sort of magnetic biological something. And so if you hadn't given me the GSA paperwork, I was going to go down a different route. But because I've read this and I can understand that this was not an ethical issue and this was not an abuse issue, I'm going to call it technical incest, and it's unprecedented. And you're a professional who, we have to sort of be seen to be doing something. So you've got a year's suspended sentence. And then in the court, somebody said, well, what are we going to do about Sophia? Because she was an adult and she was a sort of a co-offender. So they said, well, we'll issue a warrant for her arrest. And so if she ever comes back, we'll deal with it. So that's what happened. I never got officially informed, but I was told via my parents through the court transcripts that there might be something. So I tried not to believe it for many years, and I just sort of didn't go over there. And he used to come and visit here because he'd gone back to live there. But one day when I thought I really got to go and visit him in Australia, I'm just going to bite the bullet and phone the police station and see if there's anything on the system. And there was. So that was a big sort of wake up. I was like, oh gosh. And so I didn't go again for years. But then just a couple of years ago, I thought, well, look, I've grown a lot in myself and moved through all sorts of healing and emotionally and psychologically, but also understanding more, standing in my power. And I thought, if he gets married or gets sick, I need to get on the plane. So I'm going to have to go and face it. So I sold everything and gave up my job. And I went over there, but I had to engage a lawyer because I would have got arrested at the airport. So the lawyer arranged with the police that I would then go voluntarily to the police station a few weeks later, which I did. And they did the whole fingerprinting and photographing. And then I went on bail. And then my lawyer went to the preliminary hearing and the committal hearing. He wrote a letter of discontinuance, basically explaining about GSA, blah, that sort of thing. And basically they came back saying all charges dropped against you, and we see it as a victimless crime. And that was that.
Sure. Look, it's a sort of fascinating, thought-provoking, troubling, challenging story. This. So, finally, having written this book, what do you hope people take away from it? What difference do you hope it makes? What do you hope people to perhaps understand that they didn't understand before?
Yes, very good question. Well, okay, ultimately it comes back to an adoption story, really. Not a sex story or So basically, adoption can absolutely provide love, security, and wonderful families. I'm not saying adoption's wrong, first of all, but it also begins with a separation. And it's important that we acknowledge both truths at the same time. So, our early experiences help shape our expectations of relationships, whether people will be there for us, whether we're safe or where we belong. And psychologists sometimes call that the internal working model of relationships. So basically, adoption affects your attachment experience. And so when an adoptee finally meets a birth parent decades later, it isn't just meeting a stranger. It can awaken something incredibly deep about identity, attachment, and belonging. And for some people, this is so powerful that it just becomes so confusing. So really what I want to sort of, the key message is adoption isn't a single event. that happens on one day. It's a lifelong experience, and reunion is often another major chapter in that journey. And really, what I'd like to see is that every adoptee and every birth family be offered preparation, proper pre reunion counselling before reunion, not because reunion's dangerous, but because it's so emotionally profound. And, love is essential, but understanding is important. And, you know, adoption is an act of love, but it's also an experience of early separation. And I'm just hoping that through sharing this, which is obviously very sensitive for me, and that's why I'm anonymous at the moment, just to protect the boys and so on from anything, is to open up people's minds a little bit to why this can happen, instead of being disgusted that, oh, you've, because obviously I wouldn't go and have a relationship with my father if I could have helped it, sort of thing. It's much more profound than even I to this day truly understand. So I would just like readers to maybe just try and understand that it truly comes down to attachment. And
Yeah, sure.
human beings are wired for attachment, and it's all about the beginning of our life and the first relationship with our mother. So when that early bond
Yeah.
is broken, then all sorts of things can happen, and I'm afraid this was one of them for me. And yes, it
Understood.
has been an interesting road, Hugo.
Look, understood. Thank you so much for your time and for your candor and honesty as well. Really fascinating conversation, Sophia. Thank you so much.